Alrighty. Good afternoon, everyone. And I thank you guys for being patient while we get this resolved to make sure that we have everything ready to go for this session. So thank you so much for sticking around. My name is Zulema Melendez, and I am the TMDCS Support Coordinator. I'm really excited for this session because it's a little different than what we are used to having here on our YouTube channel. We normally have our office hour sessions. We also have our application workshops, and these are specifically geared towards helping you fill out your application. But I'm really excited to start this new series with our admissions deans because these sessions will talk more about topics that will be helpful for you all to stand out as a competitive applicant, and it'll give you more comprehensive information about that and how to prepare. So I am so excited to kick this series off with our first medical school dean, Dr. Cynthia Perry, the Associate Academic Dean for Admissions and our JAMP Council Chair from Texas Tech Health Science Center, Paul L. Foster School of Medicine at El Paso. So Dr. Perry will give us some insight into time management, preparing for the application cycle. So tips on efficiently managing your time, and responsibilities to prepare for a strong application, including strategies for balancing schoolwork and extracurriculars and all your application components. So if you have any questions at any time, feel free to paste those into the chat, and we will go through those at the end of the session. So Dr. Perry, if you don't mind introducing yourself and giving us a little bit more information about you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm excited to be with everyone and be the first presenter for this year's cycle. So I am, as Zulema introduced, Cynthia Perry. I'm the Associate Dean of Admissions. I'm also an associate professor in our Department of Medical Education. So I always say I have the really unique privilege to not only get involved in all of our outreach and recruitment, which we do a lot of K through 12 recruitment in our area, but then I also get to see students that I worked with and have been involved in our outreach programs that we knew from like middle school and high school, and have gone through all of our camps and seen them go on to college and then now be medical students here with us. And so it's really exciting to get to be involved in our outreach programs and then also get to teach our medical students too. And so thank you so much for having me, and looking forward to answering questions and sharing information today.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for being here. I know we started a little bit late, but I think it would still be kind of fun to kind of get to know you a little bit more. So I have a little icebreaker question here for you. If you can give us a fun fact about you, whether it be an interesting fact or a favorite hobby, food, or favorite trip.
Sure. So I think fun fact is I'm a horse girl at heart. And so if you know, you know, we're a little bit fun, a little bit crazy. Like to play outside with the horses. I have 4 horses at home and have 2 mini donkeys that are like the clowns of our ranch. And so, yeah, I think that's something different. And that's my like personal me time and meditation and wellness when I go home.
Nice. Well, I'm very glad to hear that you also have, in your busy schedule, you still leave some time for yourself and, you know, your well-being. And so I think that it's a very great way to kind of gear into our conversation for today. So we'll go ahead and get started with this time management and preparing for the application cycle topic. And I'll go ahead and start you off with your presentation.
Fantastic. Well, sorry about the formatting here, but I just wanted to share a little bit just to start us off about where I come from and a little bit about our program. So I'm here at the Foster School of Medicine, which is in El Paso, Texas. So we are about as far west Texas as you can get. And we really do hope that if you've never had a chance to visit El Paso, that you take advantage of the opportunity. We love giving students campus tours. And one of the things that we love to see is students that come to El Paso for the first time and are really pleasantly surprised at what we have to offer here. It's interesting being out on the recruiting trail over the past couple of months. I hear students and potential candidates come up and talk to me about potentially applying to foster, and they're actually shocked when I tell them that we have almost 1 million people here in El Paso. So we're not this teeny tiny town that people think we are out here in West Texas. And it's really a fantastic place to be a student. And I really encourage you guys all to come visit if you have the chance. We are also really proud of the fact that we just celebrated our 10-year anniversary as an institution. We actually admitted our first incoming class of medical students, though, back in 2009. And so we are now not just a medical school, but an entire health science center. We have a nursing school, a dental school, a graduate school, along with our medical school. We were the first medical school that opened up on the US-Mexico border. We are a federally recognized Hispanic serving institution, which means that our student population across all of our schools is greater than 25%. I think we're actually closer to 30 or 35%. And we also are really proud of the fact that our medical students actually are all required to take Spanish when they're here with us, which we think is just really important. A huge focus of our curriculum is our cultural competency training. And of course, our Spanish language curriculum is just part of that. It's not something that we require for incoming students, but we do have all of our students, once they're here with us, learn to do all of their exams, histories, physicals in English and Spanish. And it's just a really important part of our curriculum. We're also really excited that we just got our some of our Step 1 results back, and we actually had a 95% first-time pass rate for 2023 for Step 1. That's actually about 3 percentage points higher than the national average, which we were really proud of. And I think for us, that is to put that in context. One of the reasons we're really proud of that is because we're actually a pass-fail system. And our clerkship, which is your third and fourth years as a medical student, are pass-fail honors. So we really do focus on very collaborative learning experience for our students, and we actually have MCAT average that's lower than the state and national average. So the fact that our students are doing so well within our unique curriculum and actually performing better than national average on their Step 1 and Step 2 exams is really, I think, just a testament to our unique curriculum. We take a integrated clinical presentation-based approach to our education, which was actually the first of its kind in the US. We adopted it from Canada and actually brought it here to the US. And we really try to focus on training our medical students to think the way that physicians are going to actually be working with the patients. And we have our students working with patients very, very early on. And one of the unique things about our program is our summer immersion program. So our students will actually start with us for 4 weeks before the fall semester starts. So lots of really cool things going on here. And I hope that at some point we get a chance to share that with all of you and give you a tour of the campus. And if we want to jump into questions, we can do that, or however we want to do this. I know we have lots of things to cover today.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and we already have 2 questions in our chat, so we'll go ahead and get started on those since I know we started a little bit later. So our first question is from Rhea, and the question is, am I considered a reapplicant if I've applied to medical school previously and now applying to dental school?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So I would say yes, only because you've been already in the TMDSAS system. And so the dental schools are going to, independently figure out how they're going to look at you. But because you are already in the system, then that will come up in the report. So it's always good to be very transparent when you're filling out your application so that it doesn't get flagged for any inconsistencies. So definitely, I would mark that you have applied through the TMDSAS system, but when you have the chance to fill out your written responses, make sure that you clarify that you were previously a medical school applicant.
Yeah, and I can touch a little bit more about this as well on our end of the TMDSAS application. So whenever in the section applicant history, it'll ask you if you are a reapplicant, you will select yes. It'll also give you the opportunity to list the schools that you previously applied to. So in this case, it would be your medical schools. And after that, there will be a text box that pops up and it'll ask, what have you done to improve from last year's application cycle? So this is the text box that Dr. Perry is referring to. It's an opportunity for you to let the schools know what you have done differently to improve or change, in your case, your career path. And it's just a section that you don't want to miss out because it does provide that insight to the schools. And then I've heard this in the past from previous office hours and sessions with the school panels, but just to clarify, if my understanding is correctly, being a reapplicant is not necessarily a bad thing. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. We love our reapplicants and we love our non-traditional students. So today we're going to be focusing a little bit on like timelines, but I think my one thing that I want to really make sure is a very clear takeaway message is that there is not one timeline for everyone. Your timeline is what makes you special as a candidate. And we love our non-traditional applicants. We love our reapplicants because our committee, and I think that this is probably representative of most admissions committees, we really value those life experiences that those non-traditional students and the reapplicants bring to the table. So that's so important for us. If you're able to really use that time to talk about how you've done some self-reflection, how you've improved, what you've learned, how you've matured, all of those things are so valuable for us. And just think about all of those things that you bring to a potential incoming class that you've learned over that time. And so again, there's no one right or better timeline for anyone. And so it's all about, making sure that you are appropriately leveraging that time, and also how you're recording it too, so that we understand what those experiences were like for you.
Here, we have one more question. It's about shadowing and volunteering. So I think I'll go ahead and just go ahead and have it here for us to address. So regarding shadowing and volunteering, if this was done in 2022, do I need to continue shadowing and volunteering in 2024, even though I have well over 200 hours for each?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And actually, maybe now I'm going to go ahead and jump to that next slide that we have so that we can talk a little bit about what these paths look like um and what this might mean kind of to you guys as applicants. So obviously we have this is kind of what looking at what a traditional path might look like. And I'm going to walk through this a little bit and then I'm going to bring this full circle and kind of address that question directly. So this is something that we put together because one of the things that we realized is that when we were out working with potential recruits, we actually had a lot of students that were very unclear about what a potential timeline looked like and when they should start thinking about different activities, when they should start thinking about preparing for the MCAT, preparing for the actual application itself, all of those things. And so we put this together just to kind of break down some of those important points in the process. But again, as I mentioned before, this is a timeline that can be extrapolated over your own plans, right? So these aren't necessarily things that have to happen in a prescribed amount of time, right? So all of these things don't have to happen within 4 or 5 years. These can happen over the course of, maybe it's 6, maybe it's 7, 8, 10 years, whatever your timeline looks like. But again, you just want to make sure that you're spacing these activities out. One of the things I think that's most important as you're looking towards applying in the future is making sure that you are starting to get engaged in activities that are meaningful to you and also getting clinical exposure early on. Now, this does a couple of things. One, this is to ensure that you have a clear understanding of the career itself, because the absolute worst thing that we could do would be to admit a student who academically is sound, meaning we expect them to be able to meet the challenges of a medical school curriculum. But that haven't fully explored the career and actually realize that this career is not for them. So those are one of the most important things that we're looking for when we're looking at your list of activities. Now, I would also say that if you are wanting to go to medical school, you should show a continued and persistent interest and engagement in those activities. All right. So for us, it's not just about the total amount of time, because realistically, students are reporting activities that they were engaged in several years ago and have been engaged in since. But we also want to see that you're continuing to demonstrate that you're passionate about this. If you are not wanting to stay engaged in or making your clinical experiences a priority, then I guess the real question is, why is it that you're wanting to go into medicine in the first place? Because this is the career that you're going to be working in. So I would absolutely say that you need to continue to stay engaged in clinical experiences and also in community service. Now, does that need to be a specific type of community service? No. It can be volunteering in a clinical setting, or it can be working in whatever nonprofit organization that you are passionate about. But specifically for us, service is very important. And it is something that we would want to see students or applicants continue to be engaged in throughout their application process. So I would say yes, absolutely. We are not looking for a target amount of time or number of hours. We are looking for continued engagement in those activities, because we want to see what your story is. Okay. So hopefully that helps out with that. Now, we also, of course, are looking at the balance of all of your activities as well. So, of course, we understand that some students have to be employed because they need to support themselves or they need to help their family. We also understand some students may be a lot more passionate about research than about certain other activities, and that's completely fine. Again, it's all about telling your story and engaging in the activities that you're passionate about. But we do think that it's important for you to make sure you have continued exposure to the career itself. Um, just want to point out some of the more important, I think, time points in this pathway that we're looking at here while we're at it. I think one of the most important things that you can do is starting to get engaged with your advisors. Now, those can not only be your academic advisors or counselors at your undergraduate institution, but those might also be advisors at a medical school. Our office, for instance, does a lot of advising. So you can start connecting with the medical school admissions offices. Sometimes they have student ambassadors that you can work with that do mentoring. There's lots of opportunities. I would just encourage you guys to start working with an advisor or a mentor that can actually give you feedback on how you're distributing your time, and also helping you as early as possible to set up a plan. And that plan is not just MCAT prep. That plan is also, what activities are you going to get involved in and when? When are you going to start thinking about potentially taking the MCAT? And then when are you going to start your study process? Also, setting aside time for the application itself is really important. So, working alongside an advisor, whether that be your undergraduate advisor or a mentor, is really important, because not only do you need to balance your activities, but you also need to think about what your academic commitments are as well. So, some semesters are going to be heavier than others. So, you'll want to think about during your lighter semesters, is that when you can do some more or commit additional time to MCAT prep? During some of your more heavy semesters, maybe you can really only commit to doing some shadowing or some clinical activities and not a whole lot of other things outside of that. And that's absolutely fine. But you really need to be aware of how you're going to be balancing out those activities and be very intentional about that selection process. Okay. So unless there's any, I think, specific questions about this, um, one of the other things that we could jump into, or I can hold off on this, is just kind of jumping into the timeline itself of the application process. I know this is something you guys have also talked about a lot in some of your other um, sessions that you have had here, but I would also be happy to go over some timeline questions as well.
Yeah, so if you want to go back and address this question directly regarding the shadowing and volunteering.
So I think we answered the shadowing and volunteering, yes, and that we do agree it's important to remain continuously engaged. Again, though, if you have to balance out different activities, that's also important.
And this was a follow-up question regarding the continued engagement to that question.
Yeah, so I would say no. So this, you have to think about how these different activities are separated out on the application itself, and that might help you kind of think about what different categories you have. So for instance, if you're in a master's program or even a postbac program and it's research based, some of those may call it like thesis based. Um, where you actually are engaged in laboratory research or whatever kind of research. You may be in a public health master's program or another type of master's program, but you are doing some kind of research, then that may count towards research activities. But realistically, a master's program itself is not going to fit into clinical activities or service. So when I talk about continued engagement, we're talking about the specific categories, which would include healthcare experiences, community service or community engagement, research, leadership, and so forth. And so the master's program itself would more than likely either fall into research along with your academic program. So hopefully that helps.
Okay, and that's about it for our questions right now if you want to move forward.
One of the other things I did want to touch on while we're here is just to talk a little bit about planning for when you are going to apply and then also planning for the MCAT itself. And I know there's probably tons of questions about that. Um, when we think about your prepping for the MCAT, we think about when, first of all, when do you want to take it? And when is kind of considered early versus late to take the MCAT? How long do you need to study for the MCAT? How much time do you need to set aside for that? And so there's been a number of really interesting studies about this. Um, so this is actually some data that was pulled from Johns Hopkins when they surveyed some of their students, and some of the main questions they asked were, when did you take it? How long did you study for it? And during that time that you were studying, how many hours a day were you committing to the study process? So one of the things that I found interesting was that there was a really wide range of time on when students actually did take the MCAT. And that's true for us too. When we think about the timeline for actually applying to medical school, and I'm going to skip back to this slide here. So this is the slide that shows what the timeline looks like, and this is actually going to be for the next cycle, so for EY25. Your applications are the application itself for EY25 is going to be opening up very quickly here, just in a couple weeks. So you really want to start thinking about if you are planning on applying for EY25. You should already have probably studied your MCAT or started, sorry, your MCAT prep at this point. When we think about taking the MCAT, I always suggest students do commit a minimum of 3 months to that study time. Again, a lot of students tend to have more free time to be fully committed over the summer. And if that's the case, I would highly recommend you actually use the summer before the year that you're going to take it. So if you're planning on taking it right now, basically in 2024, taking the MCAT, then best bet would have been to start studying last summer when you had all that free time. However, some students may have had a really light fall semester. So that works out well too. Um, when we think about when to take the MCAT, I always say, usually it's sometime between January and May. I suggest that it is done no later than June or July. And that's because, again, it's going to take about 30 days for the schools to get the scores back. If you anticipate potentially needing to retake it in the same cycle, then my suggestion would be to shoot for an April test date. That way, you get your test score back. You have maybe a month or so that you can study, and then make any adjustments that you would need. And then you'll at least have enough time to retake it within the same cycle. If you feel like you are well prepared and you're ready, then I would say a June test date is a good time to shoot for. But again, this is one of those things where you really kind of need to think about what other commitments you have going on, and also what your curriculum or your academic schedule looks like as well. So if your course load is really heavy, then it may be really difficult for you to focus on taking the MCAT, in the spring semester. So all of these are things to think about. Now, that's just about the timing itself. Now, here is really about the commitment. So, another thing, of course, to factor in is how many months are you going to need to set aside to study? Now, again, this is going to vary depending on how much time you have available. Again, if you have a very heavy course load, then you might not be able to commit, 2, 3, 4 hours a day to studying for the MCAT. So that means maybe you need to spread it out over a longer period of time because you'll have less time. Or maybe you have a lighter course load and you can commit a really intensive 2 months to studying, and also taking practice tests. So these are all things that you kind of want to think about. And again, I think one of the takeaways here is that there's not one right way to study. There's not one right plan for prepping for the MCAT, but you have to figure out, based on what you have going on, what works for you, set a plan and stick to that plan. All right. So, any questions? I'm happy to answer questions. I know there's tons more information that I can share with you all. And we're here to help with your planning process, help answer questions. Lots of good things to think about in planning for the application process, in planning, of course, for the test itself, but realistically, that's just part of it. Oh, I can't hear you. Sorry, Zalima.
Oh yeah, I was muted. Okay, so there's while we wait for more questions to come in, we did have a couple that would be similar to questions that applicants may have. So you touched a little bit about this, about balancing all those, activities, employment potentially. So can you, for applicants, balancing coursework, volunteering, research, potentially part-time work, how can they demonstrate effective time management skills through their application itself? So more so like how can they display this on their application?
Yeah, that's a great, great question. And I think that it's something that in a really successful, well-constructed application, it's very clear to us when we're reviewing it, right? Because when we see applicants that have overcommitted themselves, they tend to have less hours in many, many different activities in the same time period. And for us, it's really difficult to understand, or know how to evaluate that, because I think when a candidate is involved in lots of different activities, but for very short periods of time, the passion for what it is that they're interested in doesn't typically come across. So what we are looking for is your story. And, whether that means that you did have to balance a job, but you were still really passionate about doing community service. Maybe that means mentoring youth. You found ways to work that into your schedule and still balance your coursework. But you also had to be really intentional and selective about the activities. And typically, students that are really successful with their time management are those that have selected activities that they're really passionate about. And that passion always comes through in the essays and in the way that they describe the various activities. And they typically tend to have fewer total number of activities within a time period, but they're more committed. So they have more hours that they've been engaged in those specific activities. And again, it's always a balancing game, but we do really appreciate students that have been able to remain engaged in certain activities for long periods of time, even if it means that during certain phases, maybe they had to cut back and then re-engage when they had more free time. So again, I think it's being self-reflective, being very intentional about the activities that you're selecting, and then, of course, having to balance that with things that you are committed to, whether that's academics or employment.
Yeah, thank you for that response. I think that it's very helpful to kind of put it into perspective, like, because we've seen a lot of times we get questions about like, how many activities do I need on my application? How many should I have? Is it okay if I have this over this many amount of hours? And so I feel like you really hit it on the nail about like the quality over quantity. So it's a very nice takeaway in that aspect. So just because we've talked a little bit about like time management, and like, being self-reflective about your activities and what you can commit yourself to. Have you or can you suggest specific time management strategies or tools that were effective for successful applicants in the past?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, it kind of links back into what we were talking about that intentionality in what you're doing and really setting a plan. And I think this is where really good mentorship comes into play. Seeking out feedback from, and when I say mentor, it doesn't necessarily have to be someone that is a professor or someone that's a physician. It can be someone, maybe that's senior to you or an upperclassman that has already kind of had to figure these things out. And they always, tend to have lots of really good feedback and tips that they can provide you. It also is about having someone that can sometimes just serve as a sounding board where, you can kind of bounce your ideas off of them. And sometimes people that know you really well may say, like, but are you just doing this to do this? Or are you doing this because you're passionate about it? So just kind of brainstorming, I think, is a really good place to start. And then from there, thinking about the types of activities that for sure you want to get engaged in because they'd be impactful and you would enjoy them. And then from there, figuring out how you're going to work those in to your plan. So that I think where that starts out is doing everything on paper. And that may be figuratively, it may be, maybe digitally, however, whatever planning tool works for you. But I really do think that some way writing these down and recording it so that you have something to refer back to is very important. And it's okay if over time things evolve and things change, but I think making out a rough plan for the next, 12 to 15 months or so is a great way to start this process. And just thinking about, what makes sense for how much time you can commit to school, to work, volunteering, community community service, clinical activities, all of those different things, and then how you want to prioritize them. I think getting that written down is really important. For some people, an actual physical paper calendar works or a planner. Um, for some people, it might just be brainstorming things out, not really in a planner itself, but that at least gives you somewhere to start. Also, using a digital calendar is a really good way to start thinking about how to plan out your time. And I know a lot of our medical students have found that really helpful as they transition into medical school because it gave them a way to better plan out their days and actually set aside study time. So I think getting in that habit is really, really important. And it also is going to prepare you for that transition into medical school as well.
Thank you. A little bit, we have another question, and it's a little bit more about the specifics of like non-traditional reapplicant, since you mentioned it earlier at the beginning of the session. So how about we go ahead and address this question? Would being a first-gen college grad make you a non-traditional applicant?
So, great question. And the answer is no. Assuming that you are on the traditional application pathway. And the traditional application pathway is not really traditional anymore because more and more students are taking time off. But the actual definition of a non-traditional applicant would be an applicant that's not applying directly out of college. So basically, there wouldn't be a gap year in between when they graduate and then when they matriculated into medical school. So that's how we define and consider someone that is non-traditional. So that may look like a lot of very different things. It may be a student that is just knows that they're going to have a gap year or gap years. It may also be an applicant that chose a different career path and then has changed career trajectories and decided to come to medicine. So those are more what we would consider a non-traditional applicant. Our first-gen applicants, our first-gen college students that are now applying to professional school, we have, you would be considered a first-gen. There's a completely different category for that, but that would not necessarily make you non-traditional.
Yeah, and then on the Team DSA's application side, there is a section in, I believe it's the demographic section, but you're able to indicate whether you consider yourself a first generation college student, and then there will be more details in there that you can fill out for that aspect. So kind of going back to the managing our activities, especially when we're working. So a question is, working a full-time schedule, 8 to 5, how many hours are recommended to study to avoid burnout?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think if we look here, you can see there's a lot of variation between how students were breaking up their study schedule. I mean, I would say that committing a couple hours in the evening is reasonable during that study time. Again, it depends on how long of a period it is that you're studying for and kind of where you are. So, I'm basing this off assuming you have completed all of your prereqs that are actually going to prepare you for the MCAT. The MCAT itself, it shouldn't be when you're reviewing and prepping for the MCAT. The material itself should not be the first time you're seeing it. It should be a review of material that you have had in your prerequisite courses. So, in theory, you should be reviewing material that you've already seen in some form, and you're just refreshing that material to yourself. And then also, it's about learning how to be tested on that material in a different format than you may be used to. So, that's about understanding the test format, understanding the format of the questions, and understanding the timing of the test itself. So, you shouldn't have to do a whole lot of content review if you are planning this out, giving yourself a few months and studying for a couple hours a day. I think that that's very reasonable to do the content refresh and then also do kind of learn about the format of the test itself. Now, one of the things I think that's the hardest part if you are, let's say, employed full time, is setting aside time to complete full length exams. And I think that that's one of the things that I cannot emphasize enough is that most successful MCAT test takers, one of the things that they will say that worked the best for them was taking those full length practice exams and also taking them in real test settings. So really setting aside the full, 8 to 9 hours in a quiet space, doing the same timing for the sections, for breaks, and taking the entire exam in that one sitting, because it's about training yourself, developing that stamina for it and getting comfortable in that test taking environment so that when you do go in to actually take the test, that you're not thrown off by any of that. Okay. And I think that that part of it is the most challenging when you're on a full-time schedule. So, that might mean setting aside, either a full Saturday or a full Sunday to do full length exams, every other week. And I know that's obviously a big commitment, but if you think about it and you're able to do that, over the course of 2 months, then that's, 4 to 6 full-length tests that you can get in. And I think for just setting aside like 2 or 3 months to do that, I think that that's fairly reasonable. So that's what I would suggest. And I think that that still gives you enough time to build in breaks, build in, other activities and, any hobbies for your own wellness.
Thank you. Yeah, that kind of reminded me of something someone once told me. If you're wanting to train for like a half marathon, full marathon, you have to practice running those distances and getting slowly up to that level, or like your ultimate goal. So that way, whenever it comes down to the day of, you're already well prepared with, you have stamina, you have practice doing that distance in shorter breaks. So it's much more easier to complete that goal.
Absolutely.
All right. Let's see. And then just very quickly, I did want to ask this following question, because in the time preparing for the application cycle, applicants do have to reach out to the recommenders to submit their letters of evaluation. So very quickly, how can students effectively communicate with and manage expectations from recommenders to ensure timely and strong letters of recommendation, and considering other responsibilities as well?
So, yeah, that is a fantastic question. And I think this cannot be overstated enough. I think the earliest possible communication with potential letter writers is so, so very important. I think one, letting them know ahead of time, like, would you even consider being a recommender for me and writing me a letter? If so, what do you need from me? Meaning some people want to see a full CV or resume. Some people want to see, might want to see unofficial transcripts. Some letter writers might actually ask you to write a rough draft of a letter so that they have ideas of the kinds of things that you would like to highlight. There's all kinds of different things. Every letter writer is going to have a different kind of approach to this. The best thing you can do is to start communicating very early on with them. I would even say a year ahead of time, because you want them to be aware, hey, this is on the horizon. I'm going to be applying next cycle. This is what the timeline looks like. And another thing that that demonstrates is your consideration of their time commitments, because professors, professionals, clinicians, supervisors are very, very busy. And so, just letting us know, hey, I'd love to get a letter from you if that's something you would consider. What is your timeline? When would you like me to request that from you? And what things do you need from me? So that you can start planning ahead of time to get that formal request in. So I think just having that conversation ahead of time is really, really important.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving us that insight, because I know that we do have a lot of times we have applicants who call us and ask this question, how early should I tell first of all, who should I have as an evaluator? Second, how early should I start telling them about my letter? What if they wrote this about a year ago or close to a year ago? And so in that instance, I will say that the schools would prefer to see an updated letter, preferably no later than, and correct me if I'm saying this incorrectly, but no later than May 1st of 2023 in this case for this upcoming cycle. So not more than a year old, right?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. And yeah, so absolutely, if you are using, and I would also mention, if you are using a letter from a letter writer that has written you a letter in the past, again, as early as possible, reach out and say, hey, I am reapplying. I would love to use your letter again. If you don't mind either updating it, I'm happy to provide you with my updated activities, or at the very least, update the date. Always start out with asking them to update the letter, though, because then it just gives an opportunity for them to talk about, some of the more current things that you've been engaged in. But the date does need to always be updated.
Yes, and so now you guys have all heard when is the best time to get in contact with those evaluators to make sure that they can commit to writing that letter for you, have it submitted. It'll then get processed at TMDSAS, and that way it is uploaded to your application as quickly as possible so that whenever the schools have your application, they will also have your letters as well. And to make sure that your application is considered complete. So I do want to be considerate of everyone's time. We did start a little bit later due to some technical difficulties we had in the back end. But if there's no more questions, I want to go ahead and pass it on to Dr. Perry for any last words of wisdom or any final thoughts or, anything that you want to echo or suggest or anything else out to our applicants who are getting ready to apply this cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. I would just really like to emphasize that one of the biggest questions I think for applicants that are kind of looking and planning ahead to the cycle is, when should I take the MCAT? The biggest thing I can say, I think the best piece of advice that I can give is when you're ready, because you want to put your best foot forward. And so if that means that you're ready in April, that's fantastic. If it means that you're ready in June, that's fantastic. If you feel like you're not going to be ready until August or September, then maybe you might want to think about waiting until next cycle and giving yourself a little bit of time. Because the reality is that if you don't feel like you're going to be ready until that late, then what is the impact on the rest of your application as well? Because that means that you're also not going to have a whole lot of time to prepare the application, to work on your secondaries, and all of those other things that come along with the application process. And so that's something to think about. It's not just the MCAT itself. And I think that's another takeaway that I like to mention is that it's really important to give yourself time, set aside time to prepare those secondaries, because by the time you've done your MCAT prep and by the time you've done your primary app, you guys are burnt out, and we totally get that. But the secondary applications are so, so important to the schools because that's where we really craft specific questions that help us to select our students. And so I know I can speak for our school here at Foster. We really place a lot of value on our secondary application. And it's also very clear to us when candidates ran out of time or didn't set aside enough time to commit to their secondaries, and they cut and paste from other essays, or they sent in a generic response that they probably sent in to every other medical school, and they just changed the name of the school. And it's not very specific to, what our mission is and what we're about. So really do make sure you set aside specific time for the secondaries. It's a whole nother set of essays for most of us. And we recognize it's a lot of work, but it's also really important for us as schools to make sure we're selecting the right candidates. And again, reach out, find a mentor, find an advisor, get lots of feedback, and don't feel rushed because there's really no one right time. And it needs to be what works for you, because we want to make sure that you're going to be successful as a student. And if you're rushed through the process and your application, is rushed, it's going to be pretty apparent. So make sure to take your time and don't feel pressure. Again, we love our students that took that extra time, took a gap year, took gap years, did other programs, did a post-bac, did some traveling, worked, got life experience, and then are able to tell us about it. And just think about all the fantastic things that brings to an incoming class, and also brings to your application. So don't feel rushed, don't feel pressure, and make a plan and stick to it. So with that, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. I think this is a great topic, especially at this point, but right before the application opens on May 1st. So again, if you guys have any questions, you can always send an email to info@teamdsas.com. Stay tuned next week. We also have another admissions Dean's Corner session with another Dean next week. More about it coming up on our social media and YouTube channel. So thank you again so much for joining us, and we'll see you all next time. Bye, everyone.